Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and a great honor at the same time. Broadly speaking, as you suggested, this will be an attempt to share with you a research agenda that I advanced in the past few decades in an attempt to understand the roots of inequality across the globe. So let me share with you my screen. So as I said, the title of my talk today will be The Journey of Humanity, Exploring the Past to Design Our Future. It is predominantly based on a recent book that I released in the past few months, a book that, as Paul suggested, was released simultaneously in 30 different languages, capturing perhaps the fact that it has a broad interdisciplinary appeal. It can be read by top specialists, and it can be read at the same time by individuals from other disciplines and perhaps any educated individual across the globe. So to a large extent, the journey of humanity is an attempt to understand the evolution of human societies since the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. In fact, it attempts to resolve two of the most fundamental mysteries that surrounds the journey of humanity. The first one I will define as the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of this dramatic transformation in living standards that occurred in the past 2 centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of near stagnation. And the second one is the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Well, over most of human existence, as suggested by Hobbes, human life was nasty, brutish, and short. In fact, human life was remarkably similar to that of other species across the globe. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards were very close to the subsistence level, and living conditions, broadly speaking, were very similar across time and across space. In fact, living standards only a few centuries ago were such that 1/4 of newborns died before reaching their first birthday, and nearly half of them did not reach their reproductive age. Numerous women perished during childbirth. Life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40 and rarely exceeded 40. And perhaps more strikingly, an economic crisis did not lead into belt tightening, but rather to mass starvation and to extinction. But then, in the past 2 centuries, the world is experiencing a major metamorphosis, a dramatic transformation in living standards across time and across space. Income per capita in the world as a whole has increased 14-fold. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in income per capita across time and across space. Now, in order to understand this metamorphosis and to illustrate in a strikingly different way, consider for a moment residents of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, Roman Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and whisk them in a time machine forward, nearly 2,000 years forward, to Ottoman-ruled Jerusalem at the beginning of the 19th century. Despite this large 2,000-year jump, these individuals will be able to adjust nearly instantaneously to the new economic conditions. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain unchanged and would not require any changes in the individual mindset. But now, take these individuals from Ottoman-ruled Jerusalem at the beginning of the 19th century and move them into Jerusalem of today. Despite this modest 200-year jump, these individuals will be devastated. This will be a shocking experience. Past knowledge will be largely obsolete. Modern technologies would appear as a witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills, and life expectancy would instantly double and would require a future-oriented mindset, a mindset that permits education decisions, saving decisions, and life cycle decisions. So something very dramatic occurred in the world economy in the past 200 years. And in contrast to the conventional wisdom, the improvement in living standards in the course of human history, even since the Neolithic Revolution, has not been incremental. Living standards, in fact, has not increased gradually in the course of human history. Technological progress, in contrast, accelerated gradually over time. But nevertheless, it contributed mostly to the explosion of world population rather than to the increase in the material well-being of the population. And consequently, much of what we see in the past 200 years can be defined as a phase transition, an abrupt transformation that occurred in the course of human history. So, if you think about the evolution of income per capita in the past 200 years, it is striking to note that over most of human existence, income per capita is fluctuating in a very narrow range around the subsistence level. And then, in the past 200 years, we see this enormous eruption in living standards. As I said, income per capita in the world as a whole is increasing 14-fold. In fact, if I would have erased from this graph the X label and the Y label, and I would show it to a random scientist, most would suggest that this is an output of a seismograph that detects tectonic activities. But in fact, this eruption is the eruption in income per capita that occurred in the world economy in the past 200 years. Now, interestingly enough, this eruption has not occurred universally across the globe. Some societies took off much earlier than others, Western European societies and the offshoots in North America. Other societies remained behind, and since this takeoff was associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita, an incredible divergence occurred in the world economy. Inequality was modest in the world economy in the year 1800, and it increased tremendously in the past 200 years. Now, naturally, the resolution of these two fundamental mysteries, the mystery of growth and the mystery of inequality, would require, therefore, the identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth across the globe. Perhaps more importantly, that permitted the origins of the differential timing of the takeoff across the globe. And in addition, it would require better understanding how forces that operated in the distant past, historical forces and even prehistorical forces, contributed to this inequality as we see it today. And ultimately, this resolution will provide us with important insights about the design of strategies that could mitigate inequality across the globe. Now, naturally, based on the evidence that I just presented, it is quite apparent that in order to understand the roots of inequality today, we will have to understand how, in fact, humanity as a whole marched in the course of human history, and how ultimately this march led ultimately into the takeoff from stagnation to growth and into much of the inequality as we see today across the globe. So when you review the process of development, one can roughly divide the process of development into three fundamental phases: the Maltusian Epoch, the post-Maltusian regime, and the modern growth regime. The Maltusian Epoch emerges at the time of the origination of Homo sapiens in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And it spans 99.9% of human existence, lasting till about the eve of industrialization in the most advanced societies in the world. And this Maltusian Epoch is characterized by interesting dualism. On the one hand, stagnation in income per capita, but on the other hand, certain dynamism in the context of technology, population growth, and cultural adaptation that ultimately permits the world to take off into the so-called post-Malthusian regime towards the 17th century, 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, and ultimately in the aftermath of the demographic transition towards the end of the 19th century, permits the world to sail into the modern growth regime. But in fact, the Malthusian Epoch holds the key for the understanding of inequality across the globe today. The forces that operated during this period ultimately permitted the transition from stagnation to growth, but in addition, permitted the differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth, and consequently generated much of the inequality as we see it across the globe today. So as I said, the Malthusian Epoch is characterized by interesting dualism, stagnation along with dynamism. Stagnation in living standards. Income per capita fluctuated in a very narrow band around the subsistence level. Life expectancy fluctuated in a very narrow range of 25 to 40, rarely exceeding 40. But at the same time, as I said, we see this interesting dynamism. Dynamism in the context of technological progress, dynamism in the context of population growth, and dynamism in the context of human adaptation. Now, at any point in time, these processes are incredibly small and slow. Technological progress is evolving in a very, very small pace. Initially, one stone tool is replacing another stone tool over a prolonged period of time. But nevertheless, over 300,000 years of human evolution, we see the transition from stone tool technologies to steam engine technologies in the eve of the Industrial Revolution. In the context of population growth, again, population growth is incredibly small at any point in time. Nevertheless, the size of the human population increases from the eve of the agricultural revolution, where it is about 2.5 million people, to about 1 billion people in the midst of industrialization. 400-fold increase, despite this epoch of stagnation in living standards. And at the same time, we see the adaptation of the human population, predominantly cultural adaptation, that permits individuals to operate more effectively in their natural environment. And it is this Malthusian dynamism that ultimately trigger the transition from stagnation to growth. Now, during this Malthusian era, technological progress, to a large extent, increased income per capita, but only in the very short run. This increase in income per capita generated population growth due to the fact that it reduced child mortality and increased fertility. And consequently, the resources that were generated were divided over a larger number of people, and income per capita reverted back to the previous equilibrium position. And consequently, technologically advanced societies or land-rich economies had, in fact, higher population density, but largely very similar levels of income per capita. So, for instance, if you look at the relationship between land productivity and population density in the Middle Ages, a measure of productivity, yes, societies that had more productive land had higher population density, as we would expect. But interestingly enough, those societies did not have higher income per capita. Economic prosperity was not related to land productivity, but in contrast, population density was. And similarly, if you look at the relationship between technological sophistication and population density in the past, you will see pronounced positive association. But if you focus on the relationship between technology and income per capita, say in the year 1500, there will be no association between the two. Namely, societies that are more advanced technologically have higher population density, but not more prosperous population. Now, at the same time period, during the Maltusian Epoch, we see a gradual adaptation of the human population, predominantly cultural adaptation. The Malthusian pressure affected naturally the size of the human population, as I just argued. But in addition, it affected the composition of the human population. Traits, cultural and individuals, that were complementary to the growth process, capitologically generated higher income. But higher income during the Malthusian epoch was associated with higher reproductive success. And consequently, this trait became more and more prevalent in the population. And consequently, this process of adaptation raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process and ultimately reinforced the transition from stagnation to growth and the takeoff that took place in the past few centuries. So when you think about the journey of humanity as a whole, the journey of humanity as a whole is governed by certain wheels of change. During the Malthusian epoch, the size of the population and the composition of the human population affected technological progress. More people implied greater supply of innovators, more demand for innovations, greater diffusion of these innovations, and as a result of it, greater technological progress. But at the same time, as I argued earlier, technological progress contributed to the size of the human population and its adaptation to the technological environment. So in the course of human history, we see the rotations of these wheels of change. The size and the composition of the human population affected technological progress, and in turn, technological progress affected the size and the composition of the human population. Initially, the rotation of these wheels of change is very, very modest. But over time, technological progress accelerated and inevitably reached a critical threshold beyond which, in order to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment, individuals had to invest in the human capital of themselves, and perhaps more importantly, in the human capital or the education of their children. Human capital formation was not free. It implied that parents had to economize on other items under budget constraint. They couldn't economize on their own consumption because, in fact, consumption was very close to subsistence. And as a result of it, they opted towards a reduction in fertility. This reduction in fertility broke the Maltusian link between technology and population. The Maltusian equilibrium simply vanished, and consequently, the growth process was freed from the counterbalancing effect of population. And as a result of it, technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in population growth, this holy triangle, contributed to the transition of societies to the sustained growth regime. And this is illustrated in a straightforward fashion in the chart in front of you. So humanity starts in Africa 300,000 years ago with a modest population. This modest population is equipped with the powerful human brain. And this powerful human brain is permitted innovations, technological progress. Technological progress, in turn, expands the resources that are available for the humanity and consequently supports larger population and more adaptable population. And this larger population, more adapted population, is contributing further to technological progress. Technological progress contributes further to population size and population composition, and the wheels of change are starting to rotate at a faster and faster pace. Despite the fact that technological progress in the course of human history evolves faster and faster, it is still too slow to justify investment in education. And in fact, as we see in the course of human history, there is no investment in human capital for industrial needs before industrialization. But ultimately, the pace of technological progress reaches a critical threshold beyond which, in fact, investment in education becomes essential so as to permit individuals to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. This increase in education triggers, as I said earlier, the fertility decline, the so-called demographic transition, and it permits the world to be freed from the Malthusian trap, to be freed from the counterbalancing effect of population, and to move into the modern growth regime, into the sustained growth regime. Now, importantly, this transition is in fact a phase transition. Namely, we move from one type of equilibrium into another one. And to a large extent, it is very similar to the phase transition that we see in nature in the transition between liquid and gas. So as we heat water in a tea kettle, initially the water remains in a liquid state. But ultimately, as we reach a critical threshold, typically 100 degrees Celsius, and we see the transition from water to gas. Similarly, a similar process occurred in the course of human history. For a long period of time, economies are in a Maltusian epoch. Economies, to a large extent, in the aftermath of the Neolithic Revolution, are agrarian. And, as I said before, the wheels of change are rotating, technological progress becomes faster and faster, but nevertheless, it doesn't trigger the transition to modern growth regime. Namely, human prosperity is not increasing gradually. Human prosperity remains stable for a long period of time. But then, once we reach this tipping point, critical point, in which technological progress is sufficiently rapid so as to justify investment in human capital corresponding to 100 degrees Celsius in the context of the transition from water to gas, we see this transition from the agricultural stage of development to the modern growth regime. Now, importantly, as is the case in the transition from water to gas, not all water molecules are transitioned from the liquid phase to the gas stage at the same pace. Some are converting earlier than others. The same is true in the world economy. Not all societies are moving from the agricultural stage of development into the modern growth regime at the same time period. And as a result of it, an incredible inequality is emerging in the world economy. Namely, some societies, Western Europe, Western European societies and the offshoots in North America are taking off at the beginning of the 19th century. Others are lagging behind for a prolonged period of time. And as a result of it, an incredible inequality is emerging in the world economy. So when we think about the roots of inequality today, it should be quite apparent that much of the inequality as we see it today is originated in forces that operated at least 200 years ago, but in fact, significantly earlier. Namely, forces that permitted some societies to take off as early as the beginning of the 19th century, perhaps even earlier, and other societies only very recently. So when we think about uneven development across the globe, it is tempting to consider superficial forces, forces at the surface, forces such as education, physical capital formation, and technological progress. And to a large extent, the economics profession focus on these elements for a prolonged period of time, what we define today as the proximate causes of economic development. But naturally, this doesn't take us very far. The question, of course, is why some societies fail to invest efficiently in physical and human capital? Why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies? And this leads us to the realization that, in fact, historical and prehistorical forces generated a barrier in the process of physical and human capital formation, generated a barrier in the context of technological progress, and consequently, much of the inequalities we see today across the globe is originated in forces that operated in the distant past, hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and as you will see, even tens of thousands of years ago. So when we think about historical and prehistorical barriers for the development process, or the deep-rooted factors of comparative development, initially what comes to mind are institutional forces and cultural characteristics. But naturally, institutions and culture are not manna from heaven. They're predicated on what I will define as the ultimate roots, namely the geographical conditions in which societies emerge and societal characteristics as emerge during the exodus of modern humans from Africa nearly 60 to 90,000 years ago. So the first part of the book is basically considering the march of humanity forward, starting in Africa 300,000 years ago and moving all the way to the present, resolving entirely the mystery of growth. The second part of the book attempts to resolve the mystery of inequality, namely the vast inequality in living standards across the globe. And there, I reverse the course of action and I gradually peel different layers of influence in an attempt to understand the roots of inequality as we see them today. I start with colonialism, I move into institutions, culture, geography, the Neolithic Revolution, and the exodus of humans from Africa and its impact on human diversity. So So let's consider first the fingerprints of institutions. So many argued that a significant portion of the inequality across the globe today can be traced to differential institutions that emerge in different regions of the world. As we know, what we define today as inclusive institutions, growth-enhancing institutions, emerge in some regions of the world, and extractive institutions, growth-retarding institutions, emerge in other corners of the world. And this naturally led into significant inequality across the globe. Now, when we think about this differential emergence of institutions, we can perhaps attribute some of them, insignificant part of it, to what can be defined as random critical junctures, namely those points in time in human history in which differential institutions emerge due to random events. We can consider, for instance, the impact of the Black Death on the decline of feudalism in the UK as one of these critical junctures. So the Black Death that is taking place in Europe between 1347 and 1352 is decimating the European population and is generating nearly 40% decline in the European population. There is enormous scarcity of labor that is generated as a result of it. And in the context of Britain, this decline and scarcity of labor occurs both in the rural sector and in the urban sector. And consequently, there is greater competition over labor in the aftermath of the Black Death. This forces the landed aristocracy to make some concession towards labor. And consequently, it triggers a gradual decline in feudalism, the emergence of property rights towards labor initially and more generally later on. And perhaps as a result of it, the early industrialization that occurred in England. Now, similar processes are not occurring, for instance, in the eastern part of the continent due to the fact that the urban sector is not very developed. And consequently, this competition between the urban sector and the rural sector is less pronounced. So this is one event, a critical juncture that perhaps can explain the importance of institutions at those critical junctures. Another typical example, classical example, is the impact of the so-called Glorious Revolution. As you know, in the context of the Glorious Revolution, Williams of Orange is defeating James II, and England is transitioning into constitutional monarchy. And naturally, one can think about a counterfactual history in which James II would have defeated Williams of Orange. The Glorious Revolution would not have taken place. And in fact, England would revert into absolute monarchy, and consequently, perhaps property rights and the emergence of industrialization would not have occurred in England. So again, another critical juncture that appears very important. Or you can focus on the division of the Korean Peninsula along the 38th parallel. Naturally, this division led into the division of a single ethnic group, a single geographical territory, into a northern sphere of influence of communism, southern sphere of influence of the West, and ultimately led into this incredible divide between the South and the North. Income per capita today in the South is 24-fold larger than in the North. Life expectancy is 11 years longer. And this is naturally due to institutions. But here, we can see how powerful institutions can be. But nevertheless, institutions, in fact, have mostly evolved gradually in the course of human history. there are few incidents of these critical junctures. Otherwise, in fact, institutions simply evolve as a byproduct of the process of development. In particular, the Neolithic Revolution that occurred as early as 12,000 years ago brought about larger population density and ultimately the formation of cities, city-states, nation-states, and even empires. And this increase in population density generated a demand for institutions that will establish property rights, institutions that would permit the coordination of actions across individuals, institutions that will permit the construction of public goods. Another important geographical element that is standing behind the formation of institutions is ecological diversity. Ecological diversity led into trade and state formation, and again, generated the demand and the supply for institutions. Another important element, geographically based, is the suitability of land for large plantations, as is the case in Central America, for instance. This suitability of land for large plantation was important because it led gradually into the concentration of land ownership, the concentration of political power in the hands of very few individuals that wanted to protect their interests, and ultimately led into the emergence of extractive institutions and even slavery. Or you can consider the harsh disease environment that is present in the past, today, and was present in the past in sub-Saharan Africa. This harsh disease environment led into lower population density and delayed the adoption of centralized institutions. So the key element from this discussion is that institutions could be important for the understanding of economic development, but they're not manna from heaven. They're a byproduct to a large extent of the process of development, and in fact, they're predicated on geographical conditions that existed in earlier stages. So this leads us to consider perhaps informal institutions, or if you wish, the cultural factor. And in the context of the cultural factor, it is important to note again that we see the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions. We see the emergence of growth-enhancing traits in some regions of the world, traits such as social capital, trust, civic participation, etc. And we see growth-retarding traits such as family ties in other regions of the world. And in fact, these differential traits were invoked to explain the Italian divide. So naturally, if we think about the discrepancy between income per capita in southern Italy and northern Italy, where the south has an income per capita that is about 2/3 of that of the north, one cannot invoke the role of institutions. The south and the north is operating under the same political institutions. And scholars suggested that, in fact, this divide has to do with the fact that family ties emerge in the south, social capital emerge in the north, and this led into much of the divide that we see across the two parts of Italy. But again, there are rare instances of random growth-enhancing cultural mutations. There are a few of them, but they're the exception. And perhaps the most prominent one is the imposition of mandatory literacy in Judaism in the 1st century CE. At this point in time, we see that literacy is imposed on Jewish families. Every Jewish family is expected to educate sons so as to permit them in the age of 13 to stand in front of the community and to recite the Bible. And at the time, it is entirely capricious religious requirement, but ultimately due to changes in the economic environment, due to the fact that human capital was so complementary to the urban environment and was so complementary for a nation that was highly mobile, we see the persistence of this predisposition towards education that lasts till this very day. And we can see it in the context of the Protestant Reformation. Emphasis on thrift and entrepreneurship in the context of the Protestant Reformation persisted over time and suggested to be the spirit of capitalism. So these are the rare events in which one can identify some sort of cultural mutation that persisted because of different reasons. But to a large extent, as I said, this is the exception rather than the rule. In fact, culture largely evolved and adapted to the environment in which people operated. We see it in the context of the rise in the return to education. It increases the predispositions of individuals towards education. We see it in the context of the suitability of the land for the use of the plow, that is ultimately generated gender division of labor and gender bias. This is in fact a research that is originated in Denmark, suggesting that the use of the plow, it required great upper body strengths, gave comparative advantage in agriculture to men over women, and consequently generated gender division of labor and gender biases as we see it today. Or you can think about high crop yields, okay, and their impact on planting, harvesting, and future-oriented mindset. Again, if you think about different societies, one society in which, in fact, geography is such that it induces people to be engaged in planting and harvesting. This delay between planting and harvesting, forcing individuals to be engaged in a future-oriented behavior, teaching them how to delay gratification, how to plan for the future. And ultimately, this becomes very important for the growth process where education decisions, saving decisions, and technological adoption are all based on future-oriented mindset. Think about another society, say society of fishermen. In this type of societies, planting is limited, and consequently, long-term orientation may be affected in a persistent fashion. So again, to a large extent, when we think about the cultural forces and the cultural factor, they're very important, but they're predicated on earlier forces, geographical forces predominantly, that operated in the distant past and led into the differential formation of cultural traits across the globe. So this leads us naturally into what I can define as the shadow of geography, namely geographical characteristics such as soil quality, climate, the disease environment, or even geographical isolation that had an indirect long shadow impact on the evolution of culture and institutional characteristics in the course of human history. Now, in addition, we can have a direct impact of geography, but this direct impact is not necessarily reflecting the long shadow of geography. It is the direct impact as opposed to the indirect impact that is operating through culture and institutions. And this direct impact affects directly labor productivity due to the disease environment, human capital formation, again due to the disease environment, and trade and technological progress due to geographical isolation. But to a large extent, the direct effect of geography has been mitigated in the past decades due to the diffusion of medical technologies from the north to the south, due to the diffusion of transportation and IT technologies from the north to the south, that naturally limited the impact of geographical isolation and created a more connected world as a whole. Now, when we think about the impact of geography, this can lead us into the legacy of the agricultural revolution. So about 12,000 years ago, we see the transition of human societies from hunter-gatherer tribes to sedentary agricultural communities. This transition is associated with the emergence of a non-food producing class. It is associated with knowledge creation in the form of science, technology, and written languages. This generates a technological head start that persists over time. And consequently, some argued, Jared Diamond in particular, that variation in the timing of the Neolithic Revolution across the globe is behind global inequality. Namely, those societies that move earlier into the Neolithic had a technological head start that persists to the present day. The evidence, unfortunately, are not very complementary to this theory. In fact, they're conflicting evidence. Think about the impact of the Neolithic Revolution in the Middle Ages. The impact is significant. But in terms of understanding inequality today, it has virtually no impact. There is no association between the time elapsed since the Neolithic Revolution and economic prosperity today. Those societies in the Fertile Crescent that experienced the Neolithic Revolution today, as you know, are not the most prosperous societies today. And Southern Europe that experienced the Neolithic Revolution earlier than the North is not more prosperous than the North. So our attempt to explore the roots of inequality is ultimately taking us back all the way to Africa, where we are all originated from. So nearly 60 to 90,000 years ago, we see the exodus of anatomically modern humans from Africa. And this exodus is in fact affecting the distribution of population diversity across the globe and ultimately comparative economic development. So during the exodus of modern humans from Africa, departing population are not carrying the entire spectrum of diversity that existed in their parental colonies, whether this is cultural diversity, phenotypic diversity, behavioral diversity, or linguistic diversity. There is some loss in this process. Migration is sequential, and consequently, lower diversity is found among populations at greater migratory distance from East Africa. So a simple illustration of this idea is the following. Suppose that we start in Africa with a population with a certain degree of, say, cultural diversity. This population is departing and migrating into the Fertile Crescent. This departing population is small in size. The original population is small in size, and as a result of it, the population that resides in the Fertile Crescent is less diverse than the original population. It resides there for a long period of time, and ultimately, some people are departing towards Western Europe 45,000 years ago, carrying a subset of the diversity that exists in Fertile Crescent. Others are migrating east and ultimately into the Americas, crossing the Bering Strait 25,000 years ago, and into South America 14,000 years ago. And the degree of diversity is declining the further we move from Africa. If we measure distance from Africa, migratory distance in 10,000s of kilometers, and we measure diversity in different ways, we will see this pronounced negative association. The most diverse population is the African one, followed by the European one, the Asian one, the Oceanian one, and the Native American population in the Americas. Now, why is it so important? It is important because there are conflicting effects of diversity on creativity and productivity. On the one hand, diversity has beneficial effects on creativity and innovations due to the fact that it generates cross-fertilization of ideas and complementarity in the production process. But on the other hand, it has an adverse effect on social cohesiveness. It is associated with mistrust. It is associated with disagreement about the desirable public goods, and consequently, it is associated with conflicts. And consequently, if there are positive and diminishing effects of diversity on innovations, and if there are positive and diminishing effects of homogeneity and social cohesiveness, it implies that one should expect a hump-shaped relationship between diversity and development. Namely, one should expect to find a sweet spot level of diversity that balances between these two effects. And evidence are very striking regarding this. If you focus on panel C, and you look at the relationship between diversity and income per capita today, you see this pronounced hump-shaped relationship. If you look at the relationship in the past, say in the year 1500, you still find this pronounced hump-shaped relationship. But interestingly enough, as we move to today's world, as we move into a more demanding world technologically, the optimal level of diversity becomes larger and larger and larger because cultural fluidity becomes important in the ability of societies to cope with this rapidly changing technological environment. Now, we see it across countries and we see it across ethnic groups. If you focus on all ethnic groups in the ethnographic atlas, you can see this pronounced hump-shaped relationship between diversity and productivity, starting from 12,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and 500 years ago. So overall, and that's very important, when we think about the transition and the journey of humanity, the wheels of change rotated in the course of human history, but they did not rotate in a vacuum. The interaction between the size of the human population, the composition of the human population, and technological progress was to a large extent affected by institutional and cultural factors, and as I said, by the ultimate factors, geography and human diversity. Naturally, the size of the human population was important for technological progress because it affected the supply of innovations, the number of innovators, but property rights were essential. With the same size of the human population, greater property rights generated more technological innovations than otherwise. Or cultural traits that are favoring education and favoring progress and are permitting technological progress to take place are naturally affecting this rotation more rapidly. Or human diversity and its impact on innovativeness affect technological progress. Or geography that affects, as I said, institutions and cultural traits. So this process that I mentioned that operated in the course of human history operated in different pace across the globe based on geographical conditions and based on differences in population diversity and their impact on institutional and cultural factors. Now, does it imply that history is a fate? Does it imply that, in fact, inequality as we see today was predetermined and humans cannot affect these matters? Not at all. History is not a fate. In fact, by considering our history, it will permit us to design our future. But in fact, the journey of humanity suggests that growth-enhancing policies ought to be country-specific, ought to be history-specific, ought to be geographic-specific. Unlike the policies that were advanced during the Washington Consensus by the World Bank and the IMF, where the idea was that one policy would fit all nations, the main lesson of the journey of humanity is that policies must be specific to the history, geography, and other characteristics of each country. And let me be more specific here. So one has to design history-dependent education policies, for instance. Think about it in the context of diversity. Take a highly diverse society. In a highly diverse society, the education curriculum will have to be designed so as to foster social cohesiveness, tolerance, and respect for other groups, so as to reduce the cost of diversity and to allow these societies to benefit further from their high degree of diversity. But in contrast, in homogeneous societies, the policy, the education policy that will have to be designed is precisely the opposite. Namely, we will have to foster critical thinking. We will have to foster the ability to challenge the status quo so as to generate pluralism in a place that is otherwise, in which otherwise pluralism is missing. Or if you think about cultural traits, growth-enhancing cultural traits, say trust in individuals and political institutions. If in fact we live in a society where due to its colonial history and corruption, we see diminished trust, naturally again, the education curriculum will have to operate in a way so as to instill trust in pupils, both in the context of trust in individuals and trust in institutions. Or if in fact we live in a society where geography was not conducive to the emergence of future-oriented mindset due to the fact that crops were not amendable for planting and harvesting, again, there, the education system, the curriculum will have to foster future-oriented mindset among students so as to mitigate this adverse effect of geography. And more broadly, key for universal prosperity based on my exploration is flexible education that will allow adaptation of societies to a rapidly changing technological environment, gender equality that will permit greater labor force participation of women and lower fertility, tolerance and diversity that will permit cultural fluidity and the advantages of cultural fluidity in navigating a stormy technological environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oded, for that wonderful talk. We have something of a binding time budget constraint, I think. I don't know, do you have 5 minutes for questions?
Absolutely.
Great. So then we will prioritize questions from the auditorium. So I think someone is there to pass the microphone around.
Well, thank you very much for a very intriguing and very sweeping journey through humanity. My name is Pieter van Huysen, political science professor here, and I'm in the middle of teaching a course this summer on human capital. So I was very intrigued by your last sort of including remarks about history-dependent education policies. So I wonder if you can tell us more, for example, for these small open economies in Western Europe, the leader in progress as you showed, that also tend to be pretty ethnically certainly homogeneous. What would those future-sensitive, flexibility-inducing, history-dependent education policies look like, according to you, more generally?
Right. So naturally, when I'm referring to this history-specific policy, country-specific policy, geography-specific policy, it is perhaps less applicable to a relatively homogeneous continent as the European continent would be. But as I said before, I think that perhaps the most striking element will be in the context of future-oriented mindset. But even in the context of the European continent, we see great variations in future-oriented mindset. And as I said before, future-oriented mindset appears to be the cultural trait that is the most important for economic growth. It is future-oriented mindset that governs education decisions. It is future-oriented mindset that governs technological adoption, and consequently, future-oriented mindset is central for the ability of society to flourish in the future. So again, if you look at variations in future-oriented mindset across the globe, they're enormous. But even within the European continent, we will see some variations in future-oriented mindset. And again, to a large extent, these variations can be mapped to initial geographical conditions, namely geographical conditions that induced some societies to be engaged in planting, harvesting, and as a result of it, activities that were conducive for learning about the future. And other societies were basically engaged in other type of activities that did not teach them how to delay gratification and how to plan for the future. And consequently, as I said, when we think about education policies, then naturally we will have to instill in students these ideas about the importance of delaying gratification. This can be done in different ways. If you think about it in today's world, part of the way that we do so is by the exposure of pupils to musical instruments. Naturally, musical instruments takes time to master and takes time to mature in terms of sounds. And this is a process that teaches pupils how to delay gratification. Again, given the fact that budgets are limited and the education curriculum must prioritize some elements over others, the idea that I'm advancing here is that the limited budget in each society should prioritize those missing elements. In this particular case, future-oriented mindset in some places and not in others.
So maybe I can ask a question from the auditorium. My name is Christine Stable-Ben. I'm a professor of global health. This is all new to me. It's fascinating. Your whole presentation was just stunning. I have a question which is maybe more politically, because one thing we are struggling with in our small homogeneous Denmark right now is the whole issue of migration and having migrants coming from other countries. The way you presented, even faraway countries, the way you presented, we should actually maybe reinterpret our whole idea about migration and see this as a wonderful diversity boost to our society, which will in the end enhance our creativity, innovation, and productivity. Could that be argued in your point of view?
Right. This is a bit complex because it depends to a large extent on the time preference of societies. So when I'm making the analysis about the impact of diversity on economic development, I'm focusing on processes that are long-lasting and were completed to a large extent. In the context of migration, part of the difficulty and part of the reason that we see some backlash in this context is that it takes time for migrants to be assimilated, and it takes time for the virtues of diversity in the context of cross-pollination of ideas to mature. So it depends very much on the time preference of societies. Undoubtedly, in the long run, migration will foster diversity and can enhance cross-fertilization of ideas and productivity. But unfortunately, in the short run, it is associated with social non-cohesiveness, as we see it across Europe. And this generates short-run implications that are not necessarily conducive for productivity. So in this respect, it depends very much on the time preference of society. It's very complex, and it's a political question rather than an economic question. The question is, how much do you evaluate the future gain versus the potential costs in the short run? But broadly speaking, yes, the argument is that as we move into a more challenging and demanding world technologically, it will be the case that more diverse societies will have the upper hand, because they will have the cultural fluidity that will allow them to navigate in this stormy technological environment.
Excellent. I'm afraid we're out of time, so it just remains for me to say thank you again, Oded, so much for this excellent talk. And thanks so much for getting up so early in the morning to give it as well. And good luck with the book. And I really hope that we see you again in Denmark at some point. Would be nice.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you very much for all of you.